that have known her very well, so at the end, if I get any of my facts wrong, please straighten us out. And I hope that through this story, you come to love her as much as I do. I will be using some of her original words. I will be becoming Minerva, and I hope that you enjoy the story. My name is Minerva Teichert, and God sent me into the world in 1888 when my father met my mother. My father's name was Frederick Cola. Is that how I say my father's name? Yes? And he was born in the East, but came out west because he was a rich man's only son who ran away from home because his father wanted him to become an accountant, and he only wanted to paint. So he ran out west and met my mother, Mary Ella Hickman, and found the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And they decided to create a life and 10 children together. I'm the second of those 10 children. And growing up in Pocatello, Idaho, we weren't rich in the ways of the world, but my parents were dreamers, and we lived in the fairyland. Growing up was beautiful. My childhood was an adventure. When I was 4 years old, my mother gave me my first watercolor set. She was the one who started it all, and since then I have hardly ever had a sketchbook out of my hand. When I was 14 years old, and this was in 1902, I went to San Francisco with a family to be their nursemaid. There I went to my very first art museums, and I took some classes at a local art school. When I was 19, I'd saved up enough money to go to Chicago, to the Art Institute. I was going to live in Chicago. My dad gave me a blessing to set me apart, and he sent me to live in the LDS mission home. Typically, this art school lasted 3 years, but because I was Miss Idaho, that's what I became known as at this school, I would go to school during the fall and winter and then go back west to work the fields or teach to earn money to go back to school. One of my mentors there, his name was John Vanderpool. John Vanderpool, I think, is the greatest draftsman America has ever had. He was crippled by an accident at the age of 14. We knew him as a little hunchback man who was so big and so high that he walked with God. I started to notice that he was more critical on me than he was the other students in my class, even though they were much poorer artists than I was. And one time I confronted him and I said, "Mr. Vanderpool, you are much more critical on me. Why?" And I'll never forget the disappointed look on his face. And he answered, "Miss Idaho, is it possible you do not understand? They're not worth it. They will drop out. But you will go on." And I wanted to go on. I wanted to learn as much as I could from him. He taught me my foundations about human anatomy, which served me not only in my artwork, but in my time as a ranch woman. Because people would come to me when they would have hurting parts of their body, and because I knew anatomy so well, I would be able to tell them what was going on. I'll then give them, I would say a prayer over them, and actually became known for my prayers over people's hurt bodies. Anyway, back to Chicago. I finished up the program in 5 years and went back west. There I worked and saved up money and tried to figure out what I was going to do next. I spent several months by myself proving up on my family's homestead in a cabin with a pistol under my pillow. I loved it. I loved the gray skies. I loved the gray hills. I loved the gray sage with an Indian on a white horse riding by with a deep red blanket. It was my beautiful, beautiful home. Now, I was 24 when I headed back. Nope. Yes, I was 24. I was 24 when I headed back west to Idaho, and I was the marrying age. Actually, to my mother's dismay, I was past the marrying age. So it was definitely on my mind. And I had a dream one night. In my dream, I knew that the man performing the ceremony had white hair. I knew that the strains from the opera Lucia de Lammermoor was playing, and then my bridegroom was wearing a tweed suit. So obviously God wanted me to be married, so the question was, who was the man and how do I find him? Unfortunately, there weren't very many Mormon young men in my area, hardly anyone at all, probably none. So, two prospects presented themselves. Prospect number one, was a wealthy and charming young man, and I thought, ooh, this is going somewhere, until he said that he would not be married in a Mormon church. And I thought, okay, I am willing to marry someone who is outside of my faith, but if you're not even willing to step foot in a Mormon church, you're not the man for me. Prospect number two, a gentle cowboy named Herman, who was German. Herman, my German. Herman's favorite sport was chasing wild horses on a desert by moonlight. Ooh. So, he and I started to form an attachment, but still my parents were not happy about the fact that he was not a member of the Mormon faith. And his parents were not happy about the fact that I was a member of the Mormon faith. So as Herman's intentions started to become more serious, my parents' intentions in splitting us apart also became more serious. Finally, they offered to send me to the Art Institute, Student Arts League in New York City. Now, at this time, the Student Arts League was where the artists wanted to be. War-torn Europe, because at this time, the war to end all wars was happening over in Europe, were sending their artists out of the country. And most of the masters, where were they heading? New York, of course, so I felt I could not stay, and I had to go. So I left Herman and the tension back home, and went to New York to study. I could tell you story after story of my time in New York, and I don't have time for that. So I will tell you some of the most memorable parts for me. The first is, to help support myself, I played in vaudeville. I was a trick roper and an Indian dancer, which is where this headband comes from. I just liked it so much I thought I'd always wear it forever after. And it keeps my brains in, which is always a good thing. My mother would have been horrified if she had known that I was doing that. I also did some more respectable things like sketching animals, and I was quite well known for that, and they were quite sought after, so I was able to support myself for a while. I eventually received a scholarship to keep studying at this Student Arts League, and was put under the direction of Mr. Robert Henry. Mr. Robert Henry is one of my dearest friends and mentors. He taught me many things, and I know God placed me in his path, not only for his philosophies about art, but what he taught me about life. One of the main things he told us as students was, stop when the story is told. And as you can see, I don't have a lot of detail in my artwork, because I feel that I will stop when the story is told. It's not about me, it is about the story. He also told us to develop our own style and paint from real life. He encouraged us, learn from the masters, know how they put together their paintings, but don't fall into the contraptions that they set up. Learn for yourself. Develop your own language as they develop theirs. So I did. And one day Robert came to me and he said, has anyone ever told the great Mormon story? And I turned to him and said, well, not to suit me. And he said, good heavens, girl, what a chance. You tell it. You'll do it well. Oh, to be a Mormon. And I said, well, you could be. And he paused almost reverently for a moment and said, that's your birthright. You feel it. You'll do it well. I felt that I had been commissioned. I knew deep down that that's what God wanted me to do. He wanted me to share the glorious truths that I knew through my art. This was my calling. This was my mission. Around this same time, I received a scholarship to go to London to continue my studies in art. But New York was already far away from my home, and London was even further. I also had an experience at a sacrament meeting in my Harlem ward. This woman stood up and said, "Many of you have come east seeking worldly success. But girls, what's a career? Go home and marry your sweethearts and have your family and know the joys of motherhood. You'll be much happier with your families than you will be pursuing a career." Somehow, I felt like it was meant for me that day. I couldn't hold back the tears as I thought of all the men I'd met in my search for glittering gold back on the Idaho desert. Herding his cattle and branding his calves was a man more nearly meant for me than anyone else in the world. I didn't want to stay in New York any longer. When the spirit of love calls, it is springtime. And I had made up my mind, so I went back home to Herman and married him in 1917 when I was 29 years old. A white-haired man performed our marriage ceremony. And strange from the opera, Lucia de Lammermoor played in the background. And guess who showed up in a tweed suit? Herman. I said, "Herman, where did you get that tweed suit?" And he said, "Oh, Minerva, I've had this suit for a while. It's just my best suit. I save it for the most special occasions." For me, that was my confirmation. Even though I was marrying someone outside of my faith, I knew God sanctioned it, and that all would be okay. 1917 was also the year that President Wilson declared war on Germany. So, with my new husband, we traveled to Fort Lewis, Washington, where he received his basic training. When he was sent to France, I went back to Idaho and had our first child, little Herman Jr. Finally, the armistice was signed. My husband was coming home. And now I had a son. Then the influenza pandemic struck. And I felt I was sinking so fast because we became desperately ill. And then I thought of prayer. And I thought of all my years of study and how I had done nothing with my art education. And I promised God that if I had finished the work He'd asked me to do, and He had more to give me, I would gladly do it. So with this covenant in my heart, I began to live. I remember that I was filled and thrilled by the heroism of the pioneers. I was enchanted by the strong beauty of the American Indian. And I was captivated by the beauty of animals in unfettered motion. I wanted to tell the stories of women, of strong women, of beautiful women, their stories that went unspoken. My living room turned into my studio. They were not ideal conditions for painting. The room was so small that some of my larger murals wouldn't fit, so I'd have to fold the canvas and paint one section at a time. Sometimes I would take my binoculars and look through the large end so I could see the whole mural. There was no north-facing window, so the light was always shifting and distractions were constant. I was running a ranch and raising a family, but I had to paint. I had to paint. I didn't care for bridge or tees or clubs, but the story of a mountain, the building of a mountain empire, and the struggles of my people drove me on, and I felt that I could not go one day without painting the story of the Great West Pageant, or that day would be lost. I felt that I had been called. I felt that God wanted me to share through my art. This is your birthright. You feel it. You'll do it well. So find your calling. Find your gift to give. This precious book, the Book of Mormon, my favorite book, is filled with stories of people who were called. Find your birthright. You feel it. You'll do it well. As an epilogue, I just want to tell you that Minerva continued to have prophetic dreams. She also received one of her dreams of Herman becoming a member of the church 30 years later and quickly becoming a part of the bishopric. One of her greatest desires was to paint in the temples of the Mormon church, and finally, when she was 60 years old, she was commissioned to paint in the Manti Temple. Soon after that, she started her Book of Mormon series. Some of you may know her Book of Mormon paintings. And she really wanted the church to accept them and use them to inspire others. But for some reason, they didn't. And this was heartbreaking for her, but she didn't let bitterness close up her heart. She ended up giving the paintings to BYU, and she continued to paint until she was 82 years old, and she fell and broke her hip, and 4 years later she died. And 3 months after she died, the LDS Church again discovered her work, and now she has become one of the most beloved Mormon artists of our time. One of her grandchildren once asked her, "Are you famous?" And she said, "No, but I will be someday." So thank you again for coming.